Okay, welcome to another episode of Building Site with me, Malcolm Sparks, and this time Alex Davis. Hi, Alex. How are you?
Hello, pretty good. How are you?
Yeah, really good. So you were going to show something you've been working on, or you just were just going to have a chat about future direction of card?
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to show anything I was working on. I just wanted to talk about a particular part of site, or I guess building apps with site, which is the need to run code really not on the client side. So I think so far in our site and card development, we've focused mainly on all of the code being in the client side and site really just serving the purpose of giving you resources
Mm.
when you ask them. And you don't even define the queries that get those resources in site. You define them in your front end project and then you deploy them
Mm.
that way. But there are definitely times when things need to run outside of the client and be more complicated than just a query.
Mm.
You might want to send an email, you might want to uh, do some uh, like complicated aggregate type thing that you can't quite do in Datalog itself. Maybe you even want to do something with an API and you don't want to expose those things in the client side.
Mm.
So there's like obviously quite a few different ways to do this. You could do it separately from site and just have another service which deals with this functionality, whether it's like your own other server that runs a closure process, or maybe you have some AWS Lambda set up. Uh, but I think it would be nice if there was something, or was at least like a recommended story,
Right.
because there's like an issue, I think, in the closure world of saying, oh, but there's loads of ways you can do this, and then just not really saying what
Mm.
those are. And especially for like newcomers and people who just want site to be their answer. Um, like we have a project starting soon that could use site, but we need answers to these things, and it would be good to have like a recommended route for people to go to that we can reuse. And I found this thing called airplane.dev, which I've posted a link to
Oh
in
yeah.
the.
Do you want to show your screen? Well, I'm just
Okay.
kind of drawing out what you. If we just finish off this kind of conversation that you might have a stream architecture or and
Mm-hmm.
where you might have a consumer listening to an event that happens, and then the consumer reads that event and say, right, I've got to do something. Maybe I've got to read some things from site, and then I've got to maybe put some results back into site, and then I might post something back on the stream, and then later on another consumer wakes up and says, hey, I'm interested in that result. So hey, I'm going to go off to site. I'm going to ask for that result, and I'm going to use it to maybe send an email. So point being that site is in this world is dumb and doesn't kind of understand. All it can do is provide a reasonable access path for data, which could be, it could be GraphQL, it could be a REST conversation, depending on the languages and the technologies that are used to access it. So this is the sort of architecture we could call dumb site. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I just put that as a kind of that is, I suppose, architecture zero of an event. So this is how you could make it work. But what's attractive about this model for me is that it's almost like site is your atom, and because of the bitemporal plane, as Steve calls it, you kind of have the ability to create a snapshot of site as you can a snapshot of a reagent atom or an app state. So this is sort of analogous to an app state. But anyway, do you want to just show
Well,
airplane?
yeah, I mean, on this like topic, I don't think I'm necessarily saying that it should look differently from this. I'm just saying that this part where you have a stream and you have something that can read things off the stream and then process events based on that, that is like a non-existent thing at the moment. you're just kind of saying, well, that's what you would build,
Mm.
but nothing like that exists. It's not something that you can just sort of plug in. Um, so
Yeah,
maybe there would
exactly.
be like another. I mean, one option is to have another repo, like, I can't think of four-letter words that quickly, but like a separate thing from site that works in conjunction with site, like site works with grab,
Mm.
um, and then it plugs into the stream somehow. But I'm not really sure how any of that would work, and it's not really clear to me in my head
Well, I think the
what that.
question, the main question is, are you in process or out of process? And there are benefits to being in process, and there are benefits to just being a network call away. And so the site dumb architecture is kind of saying that you can write different processes. You could write them in Go or Rust or Ruby. It doesn't matter, and they would have the libraries that would connect them to Kafka, for example, and they would do the plumbing. But whenever they would need to access state, which is the memory of the organization, they, rather than keeping the state in their own databases, for example, you'd say no, that's bad, because that's like having all your state scattered across all of your different microservices and systems. It's very difficult to then go to one place and say, well, what exactly was the state at this point in time, which is kind of analogous to the advantages of the app state. So that's all I'm saying here, is that site just needs to provide a good, reasonable database that allows you to put things in it. Things being documents, or it needs to allow you to query across those documents, but it also needs to provide you with reasonable ways of going over the network, and that means HTTP, REST, and GraphQL, and whatever. But it doesn't really take an opinion. It just says, well, maybe it's better to present the data. It could be for your user interface. Maybe GraphQL is preferable, but maybe for a consumer or producer of events that want to send email, maybe they just want to get like a dump of JSON email addresses to send emails to, and be triggered that way. So
Mhm.
but I don't even think that site should really do the triggering of these things. That I think it can coexist with lots and lots of other technologies within a wider architecture.
Hmm. Yeah, because I mean, I guess, having a look at what Tim had been working on his project.
Mm.
He'd kind of extended the idea of site from writing your data log queries in OpenAPI and saying, this is, slash holidays, and here's the data log query that gets the holidays, gets the users, and
Mm.
does a find and all that sort of thing. And he had sort of taken the idea of that, but instead you have get, like, slash whatever, and then you have a reference to a closure namespace,
Mm.
and that namespace gets executed on the site server and does a crux query or XT query, which is like not what you're saying, because that is then adding like actual code that runs on site.
Yeah, well, I guess it's it. I mean, I'm sort of trying to challenge people to say, can you think about a backend that doesn't have any code? But of course, that's quite a strict constraint, and it's not really fair. Um, that's I think that's an aspirational goal, but I might be completely bonkers about that. That it's nice to sort of say, well, this is where code belongs, and this is where the database belongs, and we've tried. I guess we've kind of flirted with the idea of stored procedures, that sort of thing, and that.
Yeah, I mean, where does like what you're saying is not there's not a black and white line, I don't think, because even just sticking with XT and site, you have transaction functions, and that is basically the same thing, right? That's registering a arbitrary closure function that will run when you trigger something in XT. So I think what Tim was doing, still the code is not. on the back end. You're not adding any code to the site repo. You have in your, you know, own apps folder, your your code is all still there. You're just sort of deploying it into site. You're uploading these namespaces and then they'll get run. So it's like your code is a document in the DB and you're just sort of pointing at that and saying, process that now.
Yeah.
And maybe it's wrong to have that code be processed as part of the same JVM process the site is doing. So maybe you could say instead what site is going to offer is like on the box that we install site on, we also install Python or, you know, Babashka or whatever, and then you can say run this thing. So if I share my screen, this
Yeah.
is like back to this thing I have. Will it mess up your
No, I
thing?
should be able to.
All right, well, we'll see if this works. Does that work? Okay.
Yeah, I don't need to click on. There we are. I think I can. There we are. You're live.
Okay, so this thing that I'm not suggesting at all that we use, I just thought it was an idea. Basically, if there's like a better, I don't know, they had like a sort of video, I think, if I
Yep.
mute it. Um, but the idea is that you can create a task from this sort of web interface, and you can say, you know, it's going to run in one of these processes. So maybe we just have, you know, Babashka for now,
Mm.
but it would be, I guess, relatively easy to add other things, and you give it a name, and this is basically doesn't have to be done in like a UI. You could just have this in your Open API Eden file.
Can you pull the
Um,
screen up, by the way, Alex? It's very.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, um, so yeah, if I go back a bit, I guess the idea is that this is trying to take a whole bunch of various scripts and, you know, Docker images and SQL things that people around the company will be running
Mm.
and deploy them to like a centralized place where they can be run easily from a web UI just by like clicking a button, kind of like a, a shortcut
Right.
type thing, if you know about that. And I guess they can be, maybe there's some like scheduling thing. I haven't really looked into it too much, but basically you just sort of specify the details, like the name, the parameters that it gets, and then the code itself, and you can add permissions and who can run it, who can
Right.
edit it, etc. And then you can, yeah, you can deploy it, which I guess is would be a lot like, you know, just sort of push it, doing a put into site.
Mm.
And once that's done, you can trigger it from this UI. Like you can just see a list of all the tasks that are deployed, and then you can execute it. And I guess you can make a schedule, and I'm sure that you could like call these from an endpoint too.
Yeah.
Basically, what you're doing here is you're sort of defining these operations that happen on the server side. They don't necessarily have to run in closure on site, but they're just sort of stateless tasks,
Mm.
and you just want to upload them so that they can run on the machine. And then there's some scheduling and maybe you can trigger them via an endpoint or something. But this is like a very similar idea to the whole serverless model where you have, you know, like in Next.js or one of these frameworks where you have an API directory and all the files that are in the directory get turned into Lambda functions and you
Yeah.
can call by their path. But because there is a server, a site server, it's not actually serverless. So you're not limited by the constraints that you are with serverless, which is like you can't have any long running processes and you can't have WebSockets and
Mm.
you can't have that sort of thing. I mean, maybe it doesn't really make sense to try and do that because you might get into problems where if you have, you know, long running processes and people keep spamming the endpoints or something that they just sort of spiral out of control or something. So I'm not entirely sure how this works, but I think it's like an important thing to I don't know, to come up with a solution to, because
Yeah. Oh, Alex, your voice has gone down. I think you've got to change your. You suddenly went quiet.
really.
You were a little bit quieter, but um, I'm gonna start to kick you back.
Uh,
All right. Okay. Oh yeah, you're a bit out of focus as well. Okay. Yeah,
okay.
I think if these days there's so many options about being able to send if you want to send an email, let's call that a kind of a job that you might want to run. In the old days, those were called jobs. Do you want your database to be your kind of job launcher? And I think it can launch jobs, but it could launch jobs via WebSockets, or it doesn't necessarily need to have the smarts to know how to send an email, but it should just know how to. It should have the smarts to be able to do something that you can describe declaratively, like send a webhook or do something on a. But I think you can build the real disadvantage, I think, of adding functionality to a JVM is if that functionality causes something to go wrong, you might get an out of memory error and you don't really know where to, who's responsible for it. So it's just in the same way we use containers, it's good, healthy quarantining of responsibilities, um, you know, giving people quotas and so on. And in the Lambda, in the serverless world, you can now solve that problem of processes running into each other and stealing each other's resources by just it's like a really strong quarantine where you can put a job like send an email in a very strict box. You can give it so much quota CPU, make sure it doesn't go wrong and send too many emails or whatever. You can constrain its network activity. You can monitor it and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just really um, just putting these things into containers and triggering them through API calls. So
Mm.
I'm not sure. But you can always do this by writing another JVM and just making the thing, I guess. Well, are you worried about? You can definitely do things on site with your JVM. You can always call an API. What about the other way around? How does site then call into your JVM if you've got some process and maybe that could be just really calling out to one of these Lambda services saying, like, send this email or do this. Or
I I'm just thinking, if I have a project that is like a single task, which would potentially like grow, but for now it would just be like a simple task. The task being given this XML file, produce, a PDF or something.
right,
And this needs to happen on the server side because the clients just care about the PDFs. They don't care about the XML thing. So we just want some backend service that will create the PDF and then store it. Or maybe not even store it, but just sort of, have it ready for access.
mm,
And that's not really something that can be done in a query because it needs, some libraries to actually,
mm,
generate this PDF thing. And it needs to be persistent really because it will be, accessed a lot, and
mm,
it doesn't really make sense to spin up like lambdas to compute these PDFs
mm,
because caching them becomes a bit harder. And then also there's just the fact of like keeping the deployment simple and keeping infrastructure costs low,
mm,
because this company already has like a massive problem with infrastructure costs, and I think they probably would not want to see, oh yeah, you need, like two massive JVM boxes, just to do this every one thing you need to do.
mm,
So that's really like where I was thinking of, what to do. And also, I guess keeping it closure on the back end.
Mm.
Because as soon as you start thinking about doing lambdas, closure doesn't really add a lot of value.
Mm.
Whereas if you have like a proper JVM process with closure and an integrant setup and all that sort of thing, closure suddenly has a lot more value, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. So I mean, we could draw that out really. You get a request that comes in. You want, you kind of want. Um, this is a GET request. You're looking for foo.pdf. Let's let's say, but that PDF comes into site, and that PDF doesn't exist yet. But it
Hmm.
would trigger, as it arrives, it would trigger some kind of process, uh, and you would get a PDF out the other side. But that process might involve um, going and picking up some XML from the database and then transforming that into a PDF.
Yeah.
And that PDF transformation is that is some kind of logic. Now, Site already has something fairly similar, which is you can do this put function and post function on put and posts, where you can give it a symbol, a var enclosure, and say if that var exists, then that's what the post function will ultimately be called. I mean, the semantics of HTTP are going to be obeyed. So if you kind of post, if you say you're posting JSON and you're posting CSV, then you'll get an error and that sort of thing. So I guess what you're looking for is this kind of similar, that there's some kind of generate me my body, which will be on demand and may cache a PDF into, could have the logic to say, well, we'll generate the PDF. I've already generated one yesterday, then I'll pick up from the database. So
Hmm.
but that is something that we could. I mean, there is already a thing called a body function, which in a so every representation, because at the get level, you're not. It's not really a mutation. You're asking for a representation for which the body might be not yet computed. So the body of a JSON document is different from the body of a text document. So that's why it's at the representation level, not the resource level. But that's really that's why it's called body function rather than get function, because get involves finding which representation and then calling your body function with, hey, can your logic produce me a application PDF from,
Hmm.
and or you might go, well, just could you create me a Word document? So that function can be registered, and if the jar's in the jar, in the class path, and it has that function, or even Java, then that can get called. So that's kind of what you're looking for already. I mean, whether it's a good thing to encourage people to do this is neither here nor there, really. I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, seems to be what Tim has added. So he's added a jux.site.alpha/get fun,
yeah,
and that is, yeah, a var that I guess has to exist on the site server.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Although,
And
yeah,
how you get that there, I'm not entirely sure, because it seems like Tim has actually, like, he has a copy of site
yeah,
running, and he's just added these namespaces to site.
yeah,
So, which maybe is the better way to do it than like randomly sending code over from the front end. But then you are kind of, yeah, it's no long site is no longer like a simple thing. Site also has application logic in it. Um,
but
I just
you're kind of allowing people to do that, but then they take on the responsibility for managing all of that. There was a. It's interesting because 20 years ago or more, there was a thing called EJB, and the idea is that you package up these individual pieces of logic into a jar file, and you would append the jar file to a class path, or you would actually physically deploy them through a form, and you would upload the jar file, and then the class loader, the EJBs would run in confines of a class loader, which would prevent the EJB in theory from doing things that it wasn't allowed to do. So it was running in Java Security Manager and what have you. And that was the mode at which things like this were done. That was the kind of original Lambda. And the idea is that you wouldn't have to worry about that Lambda scaling, that bean scaling, because all of the Java class that implemented that bean would be instantiated many times per thread or something, so that you would not so you could treat anything you did in terms of the fields. If you stored state in the fields of that EJB, that would be transactional. You could have 10,000 threads running, 10,000 transactions running in a backend, and you would get that being instantiated, and it would all be managed for you, so you didn't have to write that supporting infrastructure. So it's kind of similar to what Lambda is today, because Lambda says, well, you don't have to want to worry about what happens if you get 10,000 requests at the same time. Let us manage that. You just write the bit of JavaScript and imagine that you're just being called once. And so it's a similar model, but that model of uploading jars to JVMs is a well-trodden path, and there's nothing wrong about doing it.
Yeah, isn't really doing that, I guess, though, because this is still saying there's only one JVM, and that's the site JVM.
Mm.
But if I want to add another one of these get functions, I'm going to do a site deploy.
Well, you're going to deploy a jar file and put a jar file into.
No,
No.
I'm going to fully replace sites JVM with this new one that includes some extra functions.
Oh, you mean add something to the class path before you launch site? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's possible.
That seems to be what Tim has done, at least. I mean, I'm just mentioning this because I know before in Rice Lake, things weren't done like that. It was more of a site is just for resources, and we have lambdas and whatever for.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to just. Hang on. Okay. Yeah. I think. I think in that context, you've got different modes of deployment. Some people want to just do everything in the JVM, and they want site to be part of that class path, and then it goes the full range of site as a managed service that you never access except via APIs, and so that you've got a spectrum there between those two
Yeah. No, that's the way that Hasra does things. Hasra has no way of running code. Hasra says, I'm only here to manage, queries and mutations. Anything you can do in GraphQL, but any other processes like sending an email or doing any on that data, if you can't do it in a stored function in SQL, then you should do it with this, by adding a webhook URL that will call that webhook URL when something happens. So they have these triggers type things where they say, every time this query is executed, I'm also going to call this endpoint with these parameters as that are part of the query results or something. So yeah, I mean, maybe that is a better way to do it. It just makes it more difficult for coming up with a quick demo to show people this process, because having more than one JVM and it just makes the deployment process a lot more complicated, really. I guess though it's probably the better way.
Well, it depends, because if you go down everything's got to be in the JVM, you're kind of waving the monolith, and and then having loads of people hack on that, and the problem is that their code is, something goes wrong, then there's a blame game, and I think that is the direction of travel that the world is going to. That there are just lots of containers, and they're all running JVMs, and memory is, although kind of it's significant, it's not, it's not a vast cost. Particularly if you can do these lambdas in a way that, you've got to send an email, you're going to call a lambda that can do it, if that can be done. I mean, if you're on the open internet, you can call this airplane thing, right? But
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to set it up, but yeah, I mean, I wonder if there is some self-hostable Lambda type service thing that you could just run in addition to site, but in separate Docker containers or something.
well, isn't that
Uh,
what AWS provides? If you're on AWS, don't you just sort of that's how we send emails at the moment through SES. Do you just like configure Lambda and you say, hey, I'm going to call this Lambda? Because the nice thing about Lambda you have a name, don't you, an ARN for a Lambda, and you can call that thing with parameters, and it's
yeah,
you would
I
need
don't.
the AWS SDK on your class path, or you would need to, I guess, or you'd be able to make a REST call. Um,
So you're saying site would know about AWS Lambda, and you just have a resource that had the ARM or something
yeah,
in
you
the
would
same.
code the ARN into your Open API, and your Open API document. You would just code it in as an extension, and say, hey, this is calling it. I don't know, but presumably does need to be some options in modules that you can add, which actually don't amount to writing custom code, but can be kind of okay. Well, we're going to need this AWS add-on, which enables all this. Do you want to send an email, or you want to, and have all these kind of, and if you want to do a raw AWS, like normally you could just, as long as you know how to send a message over SNS, or whether that is often enough. Um, but these things, architecture is better when you are loosely coupled and you send messages. Like this idea of I need to do something, I send a message, and then something else can pick up that message and do the thing. Is what Rich Hickey espouses as a kind of almost the ultimate of decoupled architecture, because I don't have to have knowledge of the consumer. I can just put something on a queue, forget about it. And that's
Mm,
all that site really needs to do. I'm not saying that your job is going to be made easier, but I think that there is a danger of scope creep with site.
yeah, no, I mean, I definitely understand that. I'm just also worried about going too far and ending up with like a million microservices and no one can run the app
Yeah,
locally because it's just ridiculous. And
yeah, I'm with you. I like things that just run in one box and you can, um, but maybe there's a happy medium.
but that's like what I like about these serverless frameworks is that they give you the illusion. Like if I have a Next.js app,
Mm.
then I just run my, yarn dev or whatever, and I can access my front end and I can call my API routes and it all just sort of works with one process. But
Mm.
then when I deploy it, um, it gets split up
Mm.
into, a Lambda for each of the things, and then there's, a server for doing the server-side rendering and all that sort of thing just sort of happens by, I don't know, some deployment script. But when you run it locally, I guess they just have a different method of doing it. And I guess that's kind of complicated to build and to have that work well is a bit tricky. Um,
Well, no, I like the idea of having your deploying some JavaScript in as you say, the API path. You can deploy something that then the JVM can call, and you might have to put some technology in there to allow it to call it in multiple threads. Uh, but the JVM probably already has. Well, you certainly have the ability to spawn a process, and that process can be a V8, JavaScript. You can call um, what's that JavaScript engine, V8 or whatever,
yeah,
and you
but then you're stuck with JavaScript, right? If you want something that I think if your use case is fine with these like little JavaScript scripts that run for, a few seconds and you're fine with that,
not
then I think you
Code.
just stick with the existing sort of API function stuff there's already like loads of it out there, and you use Lambda or whatever. But if you want processes that actually need like Java library interop, and they're sort of heavier and they'll take advantage of multi-threading and all the stuff that the JVM is good at,
Mm.
then I think there's like a bit of a missing gap. I mean, I know you can do Java on AWS Lambda, but then I guess you've got some latency there because it takes like 6 seconds to start up or something. So you can't really do it for like on-demand things. You could only really do it for scheduled tasks or something like that.
Mm.
And it just seems like it would get to the point where you have a whole bunch of different things scattered all over the place because each thing doesn't quite fit your use case, and you're like, oh well, we have this Lambda thing for sending an email, but it doesn't really work for this generating a PDF because it's latency specific, and
Mm.
we have to make another service for that in JavaScript, and then we've got all these different languages, and everything sort of split everywhere,
Mm.
and you kind of want one tool to rule them all type thing. So I agree, it does probably need to be split up so that people aren't breaking each other's code bases.
Yeah, I think if you did have some complex logic that turned XML into PDF, possibly you would want to run it with a class of a lot of old Java PDF libraries like FOP or POI or something, And can't remember the name of this. iText. There's quite a lot of things in the Java world that will generate PDFs for you, but they'll be really custom, and you probably wouldn't want them on a class path with side because there might be a load of like shared libraries and
But you wouldn't want a PDF service, right? You wouldn't want to have a whole JVM dedicated just to this
well,
one.
some people would. They would like to run that with a dedicated class path, have the JVM startup cost take that once at the beginning of the day, and then have the thing listen for in messages or synchronous requests and say like,
That's
okay.
that's how you end up with an infrastructure cost problem, I
Well,
think.
that's kind of the microservices way, and now can argue, well, when that PDF thing is not running or is only not called very much, we only need it on one node. But yeah, I mean that is, I guess,
People don't use Java for microservices because it's too heavy and because you need so much memory to run it. That's why they use Go and
yeah.
JavaScript and these things which run in barely any memory, because then you can just have like these firecracker VMs or whatever, and the entire VM starts up in less than a second and uses like 1 MB of memory, and then you can have everything be a service. But
Mm.
when you want to use Java or Clojure in this case, I don't think that model really works very well because you've got so much upfront cost to just starting a process that you kind of need to bundle multiple things into that process to make it
But
efficient.
when the process is up and running, it's very efficient. It's not using that much memory because it's handling 50 requests concurrently as it's generating this PDF. It's going to need all that memory. That's it, So the JVM model is a sort of operating system within an operating system. You would bring a JVM up to behave like a machine, leave it up all day. You wouldn't start and stop EC2 hosts on
Hmm.
every single job. In the same way, you wouldn't start a JVM, and that's
But then, but then you have an EC2 per thing that your business needs. So maybe you have, 1,000 of these different services like your XML to PDF service, and now you have 1,000 EC2 instances, and then you times that by however many
no.
units or
Or you
something.
run it in a container. That you make that job a container, which may well have a JVM in it, but you then put it into a container orchestrator like
Yeah,
Kubernetes.
that sounds fun.
Well, it depends at what scale. I mean, if you're a big business and your job is producing lots and lots of PDF at scale, then if you're Experian and your job is to create credit reports for, you get thousands of requests for credit reports, then you might justify the cost. And that's the thing about Kubernetes in its defense, because I attack it a lot. Obviously I'm not a big fan of microservices, full stop. But the the idea is that you have lots of people in your organization with similar kind of needs, and they've got these. They're saying, "Oh, well, should we run an EC2 node for this?" And if everybody agrees to put it into the container, then you put it into a container orchestrator, then all of the nightly jobs overnight they get all kind of run, and they get all the resources, and then during the day then the resources flow, and then you've got one orchestrator whose job it is to make sure that all of these things are managed and resources are given to the processes as they need it. So if the PDF generator has not got enough CPU power and it's missing its SLAs, however they're defined, then it gets more memory, gets more CPU, and that's the nirvana, that you just share. You've got a limited amount of compute resource costed up in a budget for a company, and you share it around as a common pool, so that you get an enormous amount of utilization, rather than kind of like a waste, which is starting up a JVM just to generate a PDF, every few hours, which is a huge waste.
Yeah, I've just seen that not go well before, and
Mm.
it just is not easy
Mm.
to pull off because there's like you need a full-time team of DevOps people to just try and keep it alive and
Yeah,
keep the containers talking to each other properly. And I mean,
but it depends.
it may well be like necessary for certain use cases.
Mm.
I think for this particular use case though, it doesn't seem like it is necessary. It seems like you could do this in a different architecture where you have standalone processes that will generate these PDFs. Maybe you have like I think if you had one Clojure web server and you did this the old-fashioned way,
Mm.
like we did with Edge in the past, where you just have your back-end app, and that's like a monolith, and you have all of these different routes,
Mm.
and maybe you have a integrant thing for different components, and you have a scheduling system, and it will go and schedule processes like go and build all the PDFs this morning,
Mm.
uh, and then it will just compute them all and put them in the DB, and then people call the endpoints.
Mm.
I feel like that method, that like architecture would work a lot better for this particular use case,
Mm.
but I want to use Site and
Well, you can
get.
still do the batch thing, where you generate you do your build system, generate all your PDFs, and you put them inside. So site is just a web server, really, in that.
Yeah, it just then seems like you're not really getting a huge amount of value out of Site because you've already got your Clojure process with your Clojure app that's got all these routes and integrant setup, and just adding a crux component and then talking to it normally without Site and doing your queries directly with crux rather than through HTTP.
Yeah,
Kind of,
yeah.
it's like it's not that big a cost compared to running like a full separate service that you have to maintain and deploy. And Site seems like it's more valuable when you don't have that and you don't want to go through all of that.
Yeah. I don't really follow you.
Like Site just does access to the DB.
Right.
Like it's getting and putting stuff to and from the DB.
Yeah.
In the olden days with Edge, we would do that directly. We'd have a crux node, and that would get, passed around in the system map.
Yeah. Oh,
And
sure. Yeah.
endpoints that need to access the DB would just do a crux put or, whatever. And then you don't need Site, and you don't need to have it communicate through the internet. And that adds like a lot of extra DevOps work when you have, another service and you need to communicate with that through the internet. So,
Mm.
what benefit is it to have that?
Oh, I see what you mean. The overhead of creating something that, let's say we wanted to create something built on Edge that did XML to PDF generation and build loads of routes, and you're saying that is custom server backend code. But I was sort of assuming that people want to do that anyway, right? Then maybe not use Edge, maybe use something else. But my beef with that really is anyone who writes HTTP endpoints probably doesn't know that they're doing it wrong, in that they probably don't know how, if you want to write an HTTP endpoint, how much work it is. It's not just about a router and then throwing back a body saying 200, I'm okay. Well, that's the happy path. But, you know, a properly written HTTP endpoint should handle kind of error cases and methods and have some metadata and work in it. You know, there's a kind of argument I've been making for a long time that actually when all your endpoints are properly compliant to, you know, and will behave in a good web way, then there are all kinds of benefits that you get, like caching the PDF and all those sort of things. But that's
Sure.
like kind of by using Site, you just get all of that stuff. You upload your Open API, but you don't realize behind the scenes there's all sorts of, as you hit that 411 the other day, you know, you don't realize how much Site is doing, sort of doing what an old app server would do. It does all of the noddy low-level plumbing so that you don't have to.
But that is kind of like saying Site is just a library that handles a lot of managing the interface with the web for you,
Yeah,
and then just run all of your code alongside Site, and then do what Tim did, and have
yeah,
your put functions or whatever. I mean, that's what Tim said. He said he's treating Site like a library,
library, yeah, yeah,
closure app server, built like you would do with Edge, but instead of having to manage all the routes and HTTP stuff yourself, Site does that for you. So you just have to write the business logic.
mm,
And when I was looking at the code, it looked really nice. And you have some Site stuff that you can just sort of ignore. It's like, oh, that's setting up Site, in the init thing where you're doing all the configuration. But then you just have namespaces for your business logic, and it doesn't have to do a lot of this HTTP stuff that you would normally have.
mm,
So it seemed like quite a nice way to do it. I guess if you have a really big company that's doing all sorts of different things,
mm,
maybe that's too much coupling and you want to split it up.
mm.
But it seemed like it wasn't a bad idea to just do that and have the logic running on the Site instance. Maybe,
Well,
maybe, yeah,
I mean, it's good to hear that both approaches are possible
mm,
because, as you know, like Tim's highly competent, and he's made that architectural judgment. And the fact that I've sort of said, wouldn't it be nice in some architectures to say this is a no code solution? This is that this is an architectural constraint that you don't wire in your own code into Site. Like you can still get value from it, right? That would be one deployment. But there's absolutely nothing wrong, and that's the point of open source, to sort of open up the bonnet or the hood and put something in it and say, well, I'm going to put a different type of carburetor in and muck around with it. Only then, if you do that and the thing blows up, then hopefully you've got the engineering competency to figure out what went wrong. I'm just saying, that there isn't. If you were running a managed service, Site has a managed service, you probably would want to put the guardrails up to
yeah,
people from.
yeah. No, I agree. I think that's why Hasbro does it, right? They don't want people executing random code on their things. And they do all the GraphQL stuff, so
Mm,
that's a big enough reason for people to have it.
yeah,
And I guess, yeah, we could treat Site like that, definitely. But then I guess we just have to have another service running. Yeah, I mean, that definitely seems like it's not a bad idea. I just foresee problems where you got to mess around with like more complicated Terraform things and making sure that all your stuff is in the same VPCs and they can talk to each other and managing all that stuff. I've gotten used to not having to do
yeah.
because Hasra actually has like a managed cloud service. I guess
Well,
Site doesn't.
that would be a good reason to make Site a managed service and just plug in some implementations. And for a customer that wants to be able to send email, you want a kind of an enterprise option where you defray the cost of your own integration with AWS or SendGrid or something, you'd have to, you'd get charged for spamming a bunch, or you'd have restrictions. You'd have to pass on those restrictions, so that it's not always. But you can run that as a service. I'm definitely supportive of what you want to do, Alex. The no code constraint is more of a architectural challenge than anything else, and sometimes adding constraints, working within constraints, forces you to think in a different way, and you come up with different solutions. Sometimes they're better. So,
Yeah.
we know what it's like. You can always you can always have the escape hatch of chucking code in at the back end, which is what Tim has done, and that's the right thing at some level of scale. That's the right thing to do. At a very high level of scale, that's possibly the wrong thing to do.
hmm I think from where I'm now, I agree that conceptually it's the wrong thing to do. In an ideal world, you would just be able to move that code somewhere else into a different repo and click run this, and it just gets spun up magically, and you don't have to worry about things like cold start time and infrastructure costs and whatnot. But just for like this specific project, we're very incentivized, I guess, to use Clojure as many places as we
Yeah,
can, at least on the back end, right? Because that's the whole reason this project's existing. And I think Clojure is bad at doing these like little
yeah.
services. Like it's,
Oh no,
it's
it is. No, definitely. It's a JVM language where it has to be warmed up and then runs all day. It's like a production line. You don't turn on the production line to make one car. You turn on the production line to make 1,000 cars, and then you shut it down at night, or you don't. I think we need a set of architectural documents, so sort of blueprints, and say, you can do this. This is one mode, and these are the costs and benefits, and here's another way of doing it. And but
so yeah, and then just thinking about from the point of view of someone who's developing an app and they, let's say, a site already exists and it's running like we have with Card, and I'm just writing the front end and I'm doing my, you know, I've got like a text field and you put some text and you click download and it downloads a PDF.
yeah,
That's all the app needs to do. And I want to just make like a slash PDF endpoint
yeah,
that takes the text as a parameter and then outputs a PDF file.
yeah.
And that requires writing some code. So do I ignore, like, do I have the endpoint running on my service separate from site, and then as part of the execution of that endpoint, it then writes stuff to site through its own HTTP thing, or am I putting this in my open API at the? Um,
I think you would do it through it. You could either do it the way Tim's done it, Open API with body functions that
mhm,
are, so you're only having to implement the var. Work out a var that will take the request context, so that have all the things in there that you will need to create your PDF, your body
mhm,
string, and everything. You create the bit, but you obey you attach your body thing to the request context and send it back. So you don't have to worry about errors. You don't have to worry about, and in fact, in the new site, there is better error handling. So you can add a 400, right, and just say, yeah, this is a 400 because I didn't read the parameter, and then it will call you back through what's called there's a kind of like an error handler var. So it's a kind of another var that you can register in that entity, in that Crux entity, and that will say, oh yeah, hang on, you told us it was a 400, right, and I've gone back to the client and they said, actually, could we have the error in JSON, right? So the site has renegotiated because we had this problem with Viada. You said, oh, right, you want PDF, and you've already negotiated PDF, and then there's an error, and then you have to produce the error in a PDF file, right? And that's probably not what you want to do. You want to give them a JSON or like a text error, message. So what site will do, it will come back with anything you put in the request context. It will present back to you, so you can access it and go, oh yeah, now you can access all your own, your own entries in that map, and say, oh, well, the whole error you got from iText, where it says, oh, there's a missing kind of like too many pages in this PDF, or like wrong encoding or something, and you then generate your error in the acceptable Like you can declare in the entity that you can produce errors in text plain and JSON and CSV, and the thing will then say, well, I've negotiated. Please, can you produce in CSV? And it will call the CSV error function for you. You can register different things. So it's quite set up to be able to do that, but only at the minute put and post, not for body functions, which is sort of build me this representation. But that can easily
Well, I mean, Tim's already done that, as far as I can
I
see.
don't think he's done it right.
Okay.
Well, maybe too, we could have Tim on the show, and we could do that in Site Master because he's done that on his fork, and he could maybe talk through his implementation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I was thinking is instead of like body functions and whatnot, adding some asynchronous callback type thing to the OpenAPI spec. So you say, yeah, I guess that one gets a bit more difficult. But what I'm thinking is you add like a URL and you say forward like proxy this request to this URL,
Yeah.
wait for the response, and then just return the response, whatever that
Oh
response
yeah.
is.
Well, I mean, definitely this idea of proxying some other thing that exists. But is that other thing that exists? You're saying is an HTTP hop away? Is that what
Yeah.
is another and possibly another process?
So say you have built your separate process that's running wherever else, and
Oh sure.
it's
Yeah.
exposing like your slash PDF endpoint, but you want to put the result of it into site. So,
Oh, okay. So you want
so
site almost to be like a gateway, and then the request comes in, it will log the request, it will call out to the thing, and the body will be sort of put into XTDB.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you just make sure that your service returns the response that is happy in like the right format to be put into XT.
You know, that's a really good idea. Yeah.
And then you could have like that for put requests and but then for get requests, maybe you have like, do a query and also merge it with the result of this API
Yeah.
call or something like that. And you're just sort of having a way to proxy things. And then you could have secrets and stuff in your open API
Oh
if
yeah.
you
Yeah.
if you wanted to like, get from a weather API or something, but you
Right.
didn't want to leak your key from the front ends, then you could just sort of do things that way. So
Yeah,
something would,
that's a really good idea. Yeah, a sort of a proxy, but you can configure the thing so when the body comes back, you can say let's store it in this. Create another thing. There's an async API, like Open API. There's a sort of
yeah, I saw that.
API. So that was another idea to look at that. I haven't looked at it. I can't remember. I have looked at it. I can't remember what's in it. And then there's this other thing about you can return to the client. You can say, oh, I got your request for the PDF generator, and here's a URL that will tell you the status of that job and when it's ready. So that's what your 202 error code is for. It's to say, oh yeah, well done, thank you very much for that. Here's where you can go and get that PDF from when it's done.
Mm.
That's quite nice because it means that you're not, if it's something could get very busy and the PDF generation could take up to a minute, and then people who are waiting for 10 seconds are likely to hit F5 and give you, and compound the problem. So it's just nice to be able to get site to respond with a, hey, yeah, we created your job. Um,
Yeah, because I guess site is there to manage your state, your backend state, and in a lot of like flows, you have create PDF, and then it will show you you're in the queue position, whatever,
yeah.
and then you get down, and then you're like, it's generating now, and then here it is, and there's all these different sort of steps.
Mm.
So it's not like a one request, wait ages for it to respond with the PDF type thing. And maybe you would want site to manage that state in the DB somehow so that it's synced or
Yeah, you
whatever.
might want to know that might be something you want to record in the organization, like how many requests came in that day. And I mean, people use ClickSite and, like time series databases for this kind of rapid, like lots and lots. You can still, it doesn't stop you using that. But where you want to track something you want to record forever, some facts about the world, then you're sitting there on top of a very capable database for doing that. Um, but Yeah, that was good, Alex. I enjoyed that chat. I think I got,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
that's good food for thought. I think you've got lots of options, and it's about, I suppose, picking between them when you're on the client site. But
yeah. I mean, it does sound like our job is to sort of come in with this idea and say, here's how we do things and have answers for every question they ask. So I'm just kind of trying to ask the questions that I think they'll ask and come up with some answers for them.
yeah, I
Um,
mean, site should save you some time if it's that sort of, if there is a sort of problem that requires some API quick, let's slap an API together really quickly. Kind of like a micro, you can create a microservice which is just really site, but just deployed with, you, you know, and you've got
yeah,
quite a lot there. You've got the Swagger stuff you could show off, and you,
it's like a large bit of it though is sort of demoing a really good developer experience to their developers. So
yeah,
their developers are used to a horrible experience, and if I can go in and show them all the good bits and not have to show them, oh yeah, now you wait 5 minutes for the jar to build and
yeah, yeah.
upload. Like that would be nice.
But
So
what about the developer experience in terms of Joanna's sort of schema-driven development, where oh, she needs to add an API route to get something, and she hacks the open API. I mean, I think she had, and then she just deploys it. But that schema-driven development, although I think that we were talking about this in the last episode, the amount of times every time she wants a new capability, she has to hack the open API.
hmm,
Whereas the GraphQL approach is more, let's all get together and think of the types of things we might like to do, and then the queries don't have to involve a redeployment of anything, or resolvers,
yeah,
or the schema. The, the GraphQL endpoint can service most reasonable requests, and if it can't do something because you haven't got a type for something, you go back to the schema committer and say, hey, I've got this data in the database, I know where it is, just need a way of pulling it out via GraphQL. And I go, oh, okay, we'll add a new type for that. Here's the query, and then job done. So that, I think,
yeah,
a nice developer experience. I haven't developed that way myself for much more than a few hours, but I think it's much nicer than the sort of orchestrating a back end team and a front end team to try and have meetings and hammer out an open API and then go back and take 5 months to implement it in some cases. Um,
yeah. I mean, like I think the from developer experience side of doing serverless stuff or like the Hasra stuff we've been doing on artists where you have no code on the back end.
can't mention clients on this stream, Alex.
But we mention them on our website.
Oh well, I suppose in Alto, yeah. All right. As a
Anyway,
general rule,
like on client one, client A, um, where there is no back end code at all because everything is a service.
right? Well, you inhabited
Like,
that world for a few months, didn't you? You really saw the benefit of not having to write your own back end and manage it and deploy it. And
and we have very similar requirements. So on that project,
mm,
we have a scheduled task which needs to, at the end of the working day, um, go onto some like ancient FTP server, extract some ancient XML files, process them in some way
yeah,
into something that can then be stored in our DB.
yeah,
And for that, we just use like AWS Lambda and some Lambda scheduled things. And then Hasura handles all of the GraphQL
mm,
interface so that we can just do all of our mutations. And anytime we want to change the data structure, the schema, we
mm,
just do it like that. We just say, oh, well, actually, now a user address and an address is like this new table, and we just create that as a schema
mm,
and click save, and now it's just there, and we can look at the graph IQL Explorer and make our new query, and then just paste that in our front end, and then it all works. And that is like definitely a really nice experience for me coming from somewhere where you had like to manage all of these big stateful processes.
yeah.
run on these like heavy.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I was not. I mean, after all, I was very persuaded by that. So, as an onlooker, I can't say, I was very influenced by that in thinking about site and in January this year, and so it's a very very similar kind of product in that it wasn't Hasura wasn't doing all your FTP scripts. It didn't have to do that. You wrote those separately, and that just happened. It was another thing that you had to do on printers, but it was things you did outside of Hasura. You put it in, and then you got all the state
Yeah.
for free. And state is a hard problem.
Hmm.
Managing state is a really hard problem, and it's one that if you can get you can delegate to a product, and certainly a product that's managed for you is even better. And I think that is a compelling proposition because you can spend all your dev focus on what you should, on your business logic at the front end, and not have to worry about kind of the back end
Yeah.
approach. It just takes an inordinate amount of time in those projects.
It it just then comes back to like this project's supposed to be pushing closure, and on that other client project I mentioned, we basically don't use closure at all in the
No,
back. We, I think the yeah they wrote the Lambda things in JavaScript because they were handling that,
yeah,
and that they knew, and I guess it does make a lot more sense to use JavaScript for Lambdas. You could do it in ClojureScript, but then you're like got a whole bunch of overhead with
yeah, yeah,
compiling
yeah.
it, and it doesn't really seem worth it for these small Lambda things. So I'm guess I'm trying to think like how do I get to show the good things about Clojure, like backend Clojure, where you have a REPL and you have this sort of running system, and you can just sort of inspect it and see what it's like, and
Well,
but also
you could sort of pretend that you've written site and you can REPL into site and you can say, hey, look what I can do. And you could have your own functions there. You could add your, so that's one of the advantages of adding your own business logic. You could say, hey, I want to create this test PDF, and you could add the REPL, and that REPL
yeah,
could rest the site. So
that,
you could sort of,
that's why I wanted to do that. Yeah,
and then you can say, well, site is all, you don't have to call it site. You can say, I've written this thing in Clojure and it's all Clojure. So, I mean,
yeah.
you
I,
could do that.
I I guess I could say, here's how we've added this PDF thing, and you can add this enclosure. This doesn't have to be in site itself. Like, it might make more sense if you scale this thing to be company wide, to have your own closures process to do these business logics. But I'm just keeping it in site.
Yeah, you're just grafting it on site for the time being for speed of development. And
That sounds like a better thing to do. I guess it's still a bit unclear how you would, like, if you had your separate closure process, then what does your front end hit? Does your separate closure process, you don't really want to do API stuff, right? Because the
yeah,
site is good at that. So you want to have in your API spec somehow a way for site to call your other services,
yeah,
I think,
yeah,
because I don't see how else it can happen. But if you are, when in this setup where you have um, your GraphQL schema, I don't think you can really do it like that. So
well, let's have another conversation when you've got a. I suppose when next time you kind of hit a fork in the road and you think, well, do I go left or right? We can kind of code something up.
mm,
But I think that would. Yeah,
yeah, I think I like my callback idea,
yeah,
although I haven't really thought much about it. But just the idea of like giving a URL to your query function or your put thing and
yeah.
saying call that when
Forward
it's
to
done.
this.
Call that.
Yeah, a forward.
Yeah, I mean, you could have like a pre and a post type thing where you say, before you do this crux query,
Yeah,
hit this endpoint, get the results, and then it will give you the things you need for the crux query, or do the crux query and then pass the results of that crux query to this
right.
endpoint as your parameters or something. Um, yeah,
Yeah, it's like a route execution strategy, and you can kind of decide which strategies you want.
but you would still need like a router and HTTP libraries and that sort of thing in your other app, though, right?
Yeah, in the delegate. Yeah, yeah,
So it doesn't really save you from that. And I think there'd be a lot of cases where you'd be like, why wouldn't I just call that directly?
yeah,
Why call site? So maybe that's fine. Maybe you say I call closure service slash make PDF, I get the result, and then I call site slash put and I put the result in there. And the front end is like actually orchestrating the logic for doing that. Maybe that's not so bad.
yeah.
I guess it might be inefficient. But
I think Lambda isn't a bad out of all those things. Lambda, you put it on a gateway. It's something you can click, click, click. Sort it out in AWS console, and you can call it. But I don't want to go full circle. I mean, it's not it's a solvable problem, definitely. And
I think everything's a solvable problem, but it doesn't mean it's easy to solve.
yeah, yeah. Um, but anyway, let's wrap that up, and
Okay.
we'll see you next time. I'll post the video, and thanks everybody, and see you next time.